Hello, this is Clementine. I am her identical twin sister and roommate. Welcome to our living room. We have gathered here today to talk to you about probably the weirdest and coolest intersection of psychological theory and gaming, Persona. If you are a Persona fan, you almost certainly know that Persona, the games, were based on slash inspired by the theories of 20th century Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. You probably also don't know quite how much of Persona has come from Jungian theory. And that's what I'm here to sort of get into today. Now, one thing about me, I've been a casual fan of Jungian fan isn't the right word. I've been casually interested in Jungian theory since I was basically a teenager. So when I first started playing the Persona games in my 20s, I pretty quickly identified this connection and got really excited about it. And many times over the past several years, I have looked for some sort of explainer or compendium that would get into all the different ways that Jungian theory shows up in Persona. And I've been pretty disappointed with what I've been able to find. I haven't found much that goes past a pretty surface level of persona and shadow and collective unconscious are concepts from Jungian theory you'll find in Persona. And that's not to say that this work doesn't exist anywhere, just that I haven't found it. In fact, I find it really difficult to believe that no one's ever attempted to do this before. It's pretty foundational to Persona, and there are a lot of experts in Jungian theory out there. So I don't know why this is such a gap in the Persona discourse, but it's been really bothering me for a really long time. So about a year and a half ago, I was once again expressing my frustration about this lack of information, and Clementine pointed out to me that perhaps we would have to be the ones to do this. I feel ambivalent about it because, one, I really do think this project needs to exist, but two, I don't know that I'm the best person to do it, but I got sick of waiting. So before we go any further, let me be transparent about my credentials, or I guess lack thereof in this case. There are experts in Jungian theory out there. I am not one of them. I've spent the past year and a half reading books both by and about Jung, but I've been self-taught basically this whole time, and I would never discourage someone from self-education. But when you are self-educated in a topic, when you don't have access to subject matter experts, you are going to be left with basically your own interpretation of the materials that you're learning from, and that's it. So you may end up with blind spots or misconceptions that never get corrected. So please understand that as you're listening to me talk, that while I have spent the last year and a half actively researching this stuff, and I do pride myself on being pretty thoroughly researched, there are things that I don't know that I don't know. So just keep that in mind. Understand that nothing that I say here is unimpeachable. If you are a Jungian expert and you somehow manage to find this, and I say something wrong, I would love to be corrected. Always do your own research. Never take anything anyone on the internet tells you for granted. And there is a wealth of information for you to read if you are interested in any of this stuff. And I'd be happy to recommend you some reading material if you would like to research on your own. Also, I understand that this may never get seen by anyone, but that's fine. I'm still going to see this project through as much as I can because, again, I just really believe that much that it needs to exist. There is, I think, a pretty significant dimension of Persona that gets missed when we don't talk about this stuff. There are some pretty profound things that Persona is trying to say about the process of growing up, finding identity, and becoming yourself that I don't think you're going to fully catch if you don't understand how these concepts and these theories are influencing Persona's story and characters and even gameplay mechanics. And also, I just think that, like, if you really love a piece of work, you want to know everything you can about all the influences on it because that just increases your appreciation for the work itself. So if you are a Persona fan, I really hope that you will find this interesting. I really hope that this video finds its audience, but if it doesn't, that's fine. I'm still going to keep doing what I'm doing because I do believe in it that much. I will, as I'm working on this project, play through all the mainline Persona games again, specifically with the eye of looking for pieces of Jungian theory I may have missed in the past. So again, there may be stuff I've missed before, but we're starting at a pretty we're starting at the overview level, not with any deep dives. So I feel like where I am right now, I am prepared to make this video specifically. As I continue my research and continue my playthroughs, I will be making some more videos on more in-depth topics, maybe some more obscure and esoteric stuff, some less consequential stuff. I want to do it all. I really do. So if you do happen to find me here today, subscribe if you want to see more. Even if 0 people watch this, I'm still going to keep making these videos until I feel like I've exhausted the subject or that I've done everything that I came here to do. Cool. Okay. Oh, one last disclaimer. Jung considered himself to be... He was a psychiatrist. He considered his theories and what he was doing to be psychology. I consider it to be philosophy. I do study psychology academically, and academic psychology does not teach Jungian theory because it is not considered scientific or empirical, and I do agree with that assessment. Jung would call his work empirical all the time. I disagree. However, I don't think that makes it irrelevant, and I don't think it makes it untruthful. But I treat Jungian theory as philosophy more than as psychology. I don't necessarily think that psychology always needs to be empirical to be effective, but I do understand that that is the responsible way to teach and practice psychology, is as an empirical science. So I guess my way of rationalizing this dissonance between, believing that psychology should be an empirical science and also believing that Jungian theory is relevant despite not being empirical is that I put Jungian theory in the philosophy basket, not in the psychology basket. So I will be referring to this stuff as Jungian theory, not as Jungian psychology. That is a me thing. That's not necessarily a convention. I'm sure a lot of Jungians would disagree with me here, but just to be clear, I'm approaching this as philosophy, not psychology. I still believe that a lot of it is relevant, not necessarily all of it. Would I call myself a Jungian? I don't think so, but I do have a certain level of buy-in here. And as I've researched, there are a few concepts that I have very much incorporated into my own worldview and my own approach to self-development. And even when I was a teenager, specifically the Jungian concept of the shadow was really influential to me. And even though I didn't understand a lot of the rest of the theory and I didn't have the in-depth, well-researched knowledge, I did very much find that concept to be useful to me in my own development as a person. So just a disclaimer, I do have some personal vested interest in a lot of this stuff, but I'm maintaining a little bit of skepticism, right? Okay, that's it, I swear. Let's get started. Well, before we talk about anything else, we're gonna have to do a quick explainer of archetype theory. I've got a script over here, so sorry if I'm looking over this direction. Persona doesn't really explicitly reference archetype theory. That's more Metaphor Fantasio's domain. But this is the bedrock of the rest of Jungian theory, and we're not going to really understand the rest of what I have to talk about until we understand what archetype theory is, or kind of, at least on a surface level. So archetypes exist both internally and externally, and there is a distinction between the internal existence of an archetype and the external expression of an archetype that I want to make really clear, because I've seen people go some really weird and problematic places with archetype theory, and I think that that usually tends to stem from not being able to fully differentiate between the internal and external expressions of an archetype. So when I say the term archetype, you probably already have an idea of what that means, and you're probably thinking of the externalized archetype. So I'm going to start there a little counterintuitively, and then we'll work our way inward. Cool. So externally, an archetype, very broadly speaking, is like a type of guy. a guy who appears in myth and stories and media and even real life just over and over again, to the point where you can instantly recognize what type of guy this is based off of maybe a couple of behaviors or even just one telltale behavior. So we know that archetypes exist in literature and media. I mean, how many times have you seen an identifiable hero type or a femme fatale or a huntress, a jester? You see these types of characters and you know them. And you also see people in real life behave in these sorts of ways, and you can sort of mentally categorize that with the archetype it belongs to. So you might assume that an archetype emerges in our minds after being portrayed and consumed a certain number of times over and over. That would make sense. I mean, the human brain is basically hardwired to identify patterns, especially social patterns in the behavior of others. Um, but when we think about this a little deeper, it's okay, why are these patterns showing up in our stories and our media to begin with? Uh, these stories, yes, they're shaping our psyches as we consume them, but they're also coming from somebody's psyche or a culture's collective psyche in the case of myth or folklore. So now we've kind of landed ourselves into a chicken egg situation. Was the archetype within first and then got expressed, or is the archetype a external pattern that we've now internalized? So where you think the answer lies here is definitely going to depend on your perspective. So many historians and anthropologists might say that these archetypes that appeared in the early stories of myth and folklore came about as the byproduct of attempts of these people to explain their surroundings without the understanding that the scientific method now affords us. So, for example, how does the sun rise and set every day? Obviously, there's a guy pulling it across the sky in his golden chariot slash boat. Um, that would be an example of archetype external first, and then we see it a certain number of times. We've now internalized a sort of sun god archetype. Jung argued the other way around. He argued that myth was man projecting their own internal psyche onto the external world. He describes the archetypes as, quote, symbolic expressions of the inner unconscious drama of the psyche, which becomes accessible to man's consciousness by way of projection. In other words, the collective unconscious, which we'll get into later, is externalizing these universal stories that unfold within us so that now our conscious selves can see these concepts reflected in our stories, and now we can engage with them on a conscious level. So, from this perspective, it might be less that we are looking for an explanation of why the sun works the way it does, and more that we are using the sun's daily ritual of rising and setting as a symbol of divine order and the inner need for structure and routine. And therefore, we create a god to personify that ritual, Helios, Apollo, Ra, whatever. And the archetype was within us first and then put into myth. So, if archetypes exist internally before they become externalized as these sort of character types, what does an internal archetype look or feel like? I'm not going to be able to give you a perfect explanation. It's a difficult concept to try to distill, and again, I'm not really an expert. But this is my attempt to make it accessible. So think of the last time you had to make a really big decision. You probably had a lot of conflicting opinions running through your mind as you process this choice. So even if it was a relatively easy decision in the end, at least a few different viewpoints probably occurred to you. Um, this is the easiest way for me to explain the archetypal presence internally. Each of these opinions. Each of these voices feels like its own thing. They're all coming from within you, but they all kind of have these distinct viewpoints and these distinct voices. You, the conscious ego, listen to all of these voices as they present the options, and then you get to decide as the conscious ego who you're going to listen to, who you're going to take seriously, who you're going to ignore, and who you're going to actively silence and repress because you hate what they have to say so much. So Say you have a coworker and they screw you over by taking credit for some work you did, or maybe blaming you for one of their mistakes. Um, you'll probably have a few different responses occur to you. So maybe you've got a voice inside you whining about how you've been wronged and how unfair this situation is, and this voice just wants to wallow in your woundedness. That could be a victim archetype speaking. You could have another voice full of righteous fury vowing to seek justice for this transgression, and that might be more of a warrior archetype speaking. And then you could have someone inside you offering the option of being the bigger person, turning the other cheek, letting it go, forgiving. That could be the Messiah or the martyr. You'll field all of these suggestions, if only for a brief moment, and then ultimately make your decision as the conscious ego. Or you could just blindly and instantaneously react from an emotional, instinctual place without consciously considering the situation. And in that case, probably one of these archetypes overpowered you, and your ego didn't even have the chance to mediate. These moments are usually indicative of what's going on with your shadow, which is another concept we'll be getting into shortly. Um, for the record, I find these moments where I do act really instinctually before I have the chance to consciously mediate all the options to be very informative of what's going on in the unconscious self that maybe I need to start paying attention to. Also, we've probably all felt in different situations like we are the villain or the hero or the trickster or the mother slash caretaker. Uh, just because someone emulates one archetype in a certain situation or in a certain relationship doesn't mean that that's who they are all the time, obviously. You could have a despotic boss at work who then goes home and plays just the model family man to his wife and children. Uh, this doesn't mean that he's one or the other, he's both archetypes within, and probably a lot more. We have the ability to embody or recognize any archetype because every archetype is within every one of us. That's a really important point to understand. A lot of the misconceptions or misapplications of archetype theory kind of go along the lines of like, my archetype is X or your archetype is Y. Everyone has every archetype within them. That's pretty fundamental to the theory, is that we're all born with the same set of archetypes within us. And they're not really that easily, there's not a brief and concise and objective list of every archetype. There are arguably close to an infinite number of archetypes within all of us, but we all are inheriting the same ones, and we all have all of them. So, in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung says that the quote, the newness in the individual psyche is an endlessly varied recombination of age old components, end quote. Basically, we're all born with the same host of ancient archetypes within us, and who we become as an individual is going to be more the byproduct of the way those archetypes activate and relate within the personal psyche and how they respond to the external events that we experience throughout our lives. I actually really love this sentence from Jung because it conjures this idea that we're all basically the same person, but then we become different because we're on different timelines. Jung was pretty adamant that he was an empirical psychologist and not a philosopher, but again, that's not really how I'm looking at any of this. Archetype theory seems to me like a really interesting expansion on Descartesian rationalism because it's arguing that we're born with this kind of innate knowledge or these innate patterns. Um, but then they become individualized over the course of our lives as we experience different events and react to them differently. The point is the archetypes are not just voices in our heads that become externalized over and over. They also, once they are externalized, become ways for us to categorize both our own and others' behaviors and relationships. So, obviously, no actual person can just be reduced to a type of guy. But this innate compendium of guy types gives us a useful shorthand for the different roles that we all have to play at different times in our lives, the different voices that might be influencing the choices that we make. Personally, I find it a lot easier to make decisions when I'm thinking of the conflicting options running through my head as suggestions from the different archetypes within me, different things I could be in this moment if I chose to, but ultimately the choice is mine. I, the conscious ego haver, get to decide who I want to be in any situation. And if you're a big empiricist who doesn't find the idea of different internal entities springing up from the unconscious to influence our thoughts and behavior to be very believable, uh, I feel you. That's understandable. But I think you can still at least concede that the archetypes make for a nice heuristic for us to predict where a social situation is going or could go if we made a certain choice. But in summation, archetype theory is this idea that deep within you, innate from birth, and accessible to your unconscious psyche at any time, is this nearly infinite reservoir of guys that you can listen to, channel, or project onto others. I've read a couple different Jungians who compare the archetypes to animal instinct. Salmon know to swim upstream, caterpillars know to create a chrysalis, and humans know the archetypes even before we start imprinting story characters and real life people onto those archetypes. If you embrace archetype theory, then a baby recognizes her mother because she is born knowing that mother is the type of guy that feeds me and comforts me when I cry. Mother is who I reach out to when I need something. Now, the imprinted mother may or may not actually be the baby's biological mother. It may not even be one single person, but the baby knows what her capital M archetypal mother is by her behavior. She knows what she's supposed to do. She knows what role she's supposed to fill. She has to know this in order to survive the helplessness of infancy. So Jung posited that the archetypes are inherently accessible and recognizable via the unconscious psyche, as opposed to being learned over years of exposure to these social dynamics and storytelling. Again, it's really crucial to understanding the rest of this. So, if the archetypes are coming from our unconscious psyches, how do we all have the same ones? Collective unconscious, we'll talk about it later. But for now, it's not time for us to talk about that yet. So, let's keep it moving. So, now that we know what an archetype is, kind of, it's time to meet Persona's very first archetype. So there are some big core archetypes that we'll get into later. Those are the ones you're probably thinking of now. But the first archetype Persona invokes is a more minor yet still very important one. Meet Philemon, the wise old man. I don't think I need to explain the wise old man to you as an archetype. You definitely know this guy. He is everywhere. The seasoned wizard, the thoughtful grandfather, the relentless yet encouraging sensei. The wise old man guides the hero on his journey. The wise old man knows what we do not. The wise old man represents wisdom, experience, and discipline. Philemon is a character in Personas 1 and 2s, but what you may not know is that Philemon was also a character in Carl Jung's dreams. One aspect of Jungian psychology that gets surprisingly minimal play in Persona is the importance of dreams as the utterances of the unconscious. Um, just know that in the world of Jungian theory, dreams and dream analysis are like the key to everything. Paying attention to our dreams is one of the most effective ways we can figure out what the hell is going on down there in the unconscious. Philemon first appeared to Jung in a dream during a turbulent time in his life, in which his scientific academic pursuits were starting to be overshadowed by the lure of the messy, decidedly not empirical or quantifiable unconscious. The name Philemon comes from a character in Greek myth who was a kindly and generous old man. Philemon is also referenced in the play Faust, which is a work of fiction that had quite a profound impact on Jung as a young man. There's actually quite a lot we could talk about the history of Philemon as a character, but again, we don't have time for that. This is an overview, not a deep dive, so I guess let me know if you're really super interested in Philemon, and maybe we can do a video specifically on him. Jung's dream, Philemon, came to offer psychic guidance. Side note, please know that when I use the word psychic, I mean literally pertaining to the psyche, not in possession of extrasensory powers. Philemon's image and his role in Jung's dream really affected him and stayed with him over time. Uh, I will show you here a painting that Jung did himself of his dream Philemon. Um, it's a better painting than I could do, so I won't say anything else about it. Um, Basically, if a mythic figure shows up in your dreams and starts offering you spiritual advice, that's probably the most Jungian thing that could ever happen to you. Um, so I guess if that does happen to you, write it down, let me know. If you've only played the modern personas, which is just what I'll call personas 3 through 5, you might not even realize how important Philemon is to the series. Personas 1 and 2s featured a younger looking yassified Philemon as our guide into the mysterious intersection of the conscious and the unconscious. In the Persona 2 extended universe, he's an almost godlike advocate for humanity's drive towards self-development and personal progress, which is basically the entire point of Jungian theory. Philemon notably also first appears to our Persona characters in the original Persona in a dream, just like he appeared to Jung. And look, I know what you're thinking. For a wise old man, this guy sure doesn't look that old. But what you have to remember is that the archetype is not literal, it's more of a vibe. The archetype as it exists internally doesn't have an actual form. The wise old man is just the characterization we give to the internal voice that is associated with wisdom and positive discipline. Um, that voice doesn't exist within us as actually an old man. So a wise old man could appear as a child or a woman or a dog or a tree. It's the essence of the wise old man that makes it a wise old man archetype. The behavior, the voice of wise old man. The important thing here is that Philemon is the guy who knows a lot of stuff that would be really helpful to share with us, but he's not going to do it because the journey of our growth is more important. That is classic old wise man shit. Now, sadly, Philemon was eventually let go by Atlus once production for Persona 3 began, and I don't actually know why, but I heard that Maya was threatening to file a workplace harassment lawsuit. Also, his wigs had to be so expensive. So now, even though the occasional butterfly iconography is all we really have left of Philemon, we do still have the wise old man. He just now appears to us as Igor, not Philemon. Igor was formerly just our persona fusing guy, and I have a whole thing about that. I think is the key word here. I think the persona fusion process is maybe an allegory for alchemy. The works of the alchemists ended up being quite influential for Jung's perspective on psychology, even though they don't really seem connected. Um, I don't have the space or time to get into that right now, but I think that Igor's original role as just persona fusing guy was probably more of an alchemy related archetype. But now he is graduated to wise old man. And I mean, good for him. He certainly looks the part more than Philemon did, and maybe that's part of why he got the promotion. But the point is, the wise old man has been a pretty central figure to Persona since the beginning, even if he has switched forms. I do love Igor, but Philemon was just a really cool esoteric bit of Jungian lore, and I do miss his presence. And his fabulous ponytail. So let's get into Persona's next big archetype. I'll bet you'll never guess what it is. Persona! Persona is one of the primary core archetypes that we use basically every day. And it's one of the most important and useful voices in our heads. Persona is what gives us our ability to adapt our behavior and our demeanor to whatever it is that we want to project to our current environment. Persona creates your customer-facing UI, so to speak. It shows what you want others to see. That's persona as an archetype. Persona as it exists in Persona is a badass mythic entity that astral projects out of your brain to eviscerate psychic monsters. Iconically, persona is Latin for mask. A lot of the big archetypes were named by Jung with Latin words. We've seen a lot of masks in Persona, especially in Personas 2.1 and 5. We use the word persona a lot colloquially to refer to whatever specific role we're playing. I do think it's important to note that the mask changes depending on the context that we're in, but all those different versions of the mask are still contained within persona. So when my persona is active, it may look and sound and behave a lot differently depending on where I am and who I'm with. I talk to this camera differently from how I would talk to my coworkers or to a police officer, but in all these cases, I am playing a role to some extent. I'm not spouting out my raw, unfiltered inner monologue or acting on pure instinct. There are social expectations that I'm responding to and goals that I'm trying to achieve with my behavior. And I'm doing this by trying to appear a certain way, such as knowledgeable or professional or like a model law-abiding citizen officer. Colloquially, we might say that we have a work persona or a YouTube persona, and each of these might resemble a different archetype or combination of archetypes that we're emulating in that instance. There are also probably some common themes across all different versions of the persona. Like, it doesn't matter where I am or who I'm with, I really need people to see me as intelligent. But my persona is still going to change with context. It doesn't have one set static personality, and that can make it a little difficult to understand. Now, Persona, the series, mostly features persona as a bunch of separate, discrete entities as opposed to one constantly shifting and changing entity per person. They're almost more like archetypes in the way that they function and in what they represent. They're all mythic slash folkloric figures, and they're all categorized by an arcana that has its own archetypal connotation. Each different entity is called persona when it's deployed, regardless of the archetype that they represent. Whether it's Arsène the Phantom Thief or Orpheus the Challenger of Death, they are serving the function of persona despite their resemblance to other archetypes. Now, the ability to deploy persona is called the power of persona, usually within the persona universe. In the Jungian theory sense, I think this power of persona is maybe a better way to conceptualize the archetype of persona or its role. If you've played Metaphor ReFantasia, which is another Atlus IP based on Jungian theory, then the masked dancer archetype lineage, I think, embodies the persona archetype perfectly. She, being the masked dancer, can change her mask to whatever you want it to be, but there is this core archetypal entity that stays the same behind each mask. I can't really get started on metaphor right now. That's probably going to need to be its own series of videos. But if archetype theory intrigues you, definitely play Metaphor ReFantasio. It's got a pretty decent grasp on what that can look like. Now, Personas 1 and 2s were a little more on track with the persona metaphor, if you can even call it a metaphor when it literally has the same name. But in the modern Personas, only our playable protagonist has the wild card ability to change their persona. In real life, we all have the wild card ability. I mean, life would be really hard if you only had one face to your persona that you could ever use. I mean, imagine having to act the same way at grandma's 85th birthday soiree as you did at Kyle's basement kickback. In the first personas, every party member had the ability to switch among multiple personas despite having one initial innate persona with whom they have a special bond. However, personas from certain arcana are more compatible with a party member than others. Equipping an incompatible persona has an adverse effect on its power, and equipping a highly compatible persona boosts what the party member can do with it. This works pretty well for me as a metaphor because we can all, in theory, play any role or channel any archetype through our persona, but obviously some patterns of behavior are going to come much more naturally to us than others. And we all probably have a certain very personal ideal persona that we would like the world to see us as. Philemon speaks many times of the many yous inside. To the party, he's talking about the cornucopia of personas that they can summon, but to us, the players, I think he's referring to the near infinite store of archetypes within us that we can access and use and model our personas after. Now, Persona 3 is where the persona metaphor starts to fall apart a little bit. Now our party members only have this one innate, unfused persona that naturally occurs within them. Unless, of course, they are the specialist boy in the world. Each person's one persona is supposedly birthed from their true self as some authentic expression of that person's nature. In Persona 3, Fuka tells Yukari that her persona comes from deep within her and is an expression of her authentic self. In Persona 5, the party's persona awakenings are these literal mask-off moments, which is a diametrically oppositional symbol to the one of persona putting the mask on. I think that Atlus is trying to use their in-game persona as a symbol for a few different Jungian concepts at once, and so it gets pretty muddled. In addition to symbolizing persona, persona is also symbolizing the archetypes in general, and it's also symbolizing the true self, which is another concept of its own that we'll get into toward the end of this video. When we're talking about the Jungian persona, it could behave in an authentic way to the inner true self, or it could not. It depends on our environment and our intentions. In fact, a lot of the times our persona is playing a role that is not authentic to our true selves whatsoever. Persona is often a pragmatic function. It's a social survival tool. It is a venue for individualistic expression in the sense that we manipulate it to match what we want to show others. But it's a manufactured projection, not a natural, innate, authentic one necessarily. In fact, it's kind of definitional to the persona that it's not our true nature, but rather our instinct to wallpaper over it. I don't know why this was changed in the Persona games. I'm going to assume it was determined to be better for gameplay overall, and I'm never going to fault Atlus for prioritizing gameplay over complete loyalty to Jungian principles, because they are making video games after all, and they need to be playable. Persona 4 does mostly the same thing as Persona 3, with the notable addition of pairing the persona with the shadow, portraying them as two sides of the same coin, or as two states of being embodied at different times by the same core entity. We'll get into this more in a minute when we start talking about the shadow. Now, Persona 5, while still leaning into this in-game persona as an outgrowth of the true self, it also reintroduces the persona archetype in a subtler, slightly more grounded way that I find pretty interesting. In Persona 5, all our party members actually physically wear masks when they're in the metaverse. They wear costumes that come along with these masks, and they have specific code names that they adopt when they enter the metaverse. It's like when they awaken to their personas, they also awaken to these metaverse alter egos, which are personas in the colloquial sense. I mean, you could even say that Ryuji has the persona Skull, and Skull has the persona Captain Kidd. Joker, Panther, Skull, and so on are actually better representations of the Jungian concept of persona as a role assumed to interface with the environment that reflects the desires of the true self, but is ultimately a performance. I think maybe this is Atlus trying to course correct a little bit after getting so far off track with the original metaphor, but I don't know for sure. Persona seems pretty confused about what their titular persona is actually here to do. I don't know how else to explain how we can have Morgana describing personas as hiding behind masks, and then Igor describing personas as the actual masks themselves, just moments away from each other in the same game. I'm interested to see how they handle this in Persona 6, whether they will embrace the persona as its own evolved entity that has become something quite different from its symbolic progenitor, or whether they will try to re-anchor persona within its original material. There's truly hours of material to discuss when it comes to persona and persona. There's the imagery, the awakenings, the evolutions, what all of it means. We don't have time for that right now. Again, this is an overview. We're going to move along to Shadow now, but I will probably at some point in the future revisit Persona with its own video because, again, there is just so much to say here.
I am a shadow, the true self.
Imagine a stranger lurking in the dark and staring your way. He seems to know you, but you don't know him. Or do you? As he continues to stare your way, your blood runs cold and you start to feel sick. Whatever you were thinking before, it's been replaced by a single imperative. You have to get out of here, far away from this guy. That's the shadow archetype externalized. A repulsive, threatening stranger that you instinctively fear. But internally, this stranger is you. Here's a quote from Jung. The other in us is indeed an other, a live man who actually thinks, does, feels, and desires all the things that are despicable and odious. A true man knows that his most bitter foe, or indeed a whole host of enemies, does not equal that one worst adversary, that other self. We all have pieces of ourselves that we just can't bear to look at. Some of us more than others, but we all have them. Sometimes they're things that we've been told are wrong or bad, so we repress them to be better or more likable to others. Sometimes they're things that contradict the image we want so badly to have of ourselves, so we have to rationalize the cognitive dissonance away. Like, I'm not selfish, I have boundaries. I'm not rude, I'm just honest. I think it's important to note that a lot of the time, these things in ourselves that we try to reject are fairly neutral or even potentially positive traits originally, but after being exiled from consciousness and left to rot, they become part of our shadow. We'll use an example from Persona 4, which is the Persona game with the best grasp on the shadow archetype in general. Yukiko Amagi values autonomy. In a more individualistic society, this might not seem out of place. However, Yukiko lives in Japan in a small town. She belongs to a highly collectivist society, and she's the only daughter of a business-owning family who expects her to inherit and keep alive the historic Amagi Inn. After growing up under the unquestionable assumption that she will gladly follow in her mother's footsteps to manage the inn, she learns to repress her value of independence and even vilifies it. This frustrated drive for independence becomes a miserable feeling of helplessness as it festers in the unconscious, then becoming part of Yukiko's shadow. Yukiko longs for choice in her life trajectory, but she has been compelled to reject autonomy. So now the only escape she can imagine is being saved by someone else, the prince that her shadow speaks of. Yukiko is specifically envious of the freedom and independence she sees in others that she believes cannot possibly belong to her as well. Even though it already does, she just needs to face and accept her shadow to realize that. Again, a quote from Jung: "Whoever goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself. The mirror does not flatter, it faithfully shows whatever looks into it, namely the face we never show to the world because we cover it with the persona. The meeting with ourselves belongs to the more unpleasant things that can be avoided, so long as we can project everything negative into the environment. But if we are able to see our own shadow and can bear knowing about it, then a small part of the problem has already been solved. We have at least brought up the personal unconscious. The shadow is a living part of the personality and therefore wants to live with it in some form." End quote. In Persona 4, we see each party member go through this exact confrontation with the self. Once the shadow is accepted and incorporated, it gets to live with the rest of the personality and be heard. In Persona 4, this transformation goes so far that the shadow actually evolves into the persona.
So I always find it annoying when other people do this in the videos that I'm watching, but I do have to interrupt myself really briefly because I learned something as I was editing this video that I think I need to interject because I'm kind of operating under a misconception here. I believed that this pairing of the shadow and the persona as if they are like the same entity just in different states of being, um, that was unique to Persona 4, and what I have realized now is that it is not. Um, the first thing I noticed that made me start questioning this was in Persona 5, as I was editing in footage of the Persona Awakenings. I noticed that everyone gets the shadow eyes right before and during their Persona Awakening. Like, you know, those yellow eyes that the shadows have. All our Persona 5 party members temporarily get the yellow shadow eyes as they're about to have their awakening, as they're birthing their persona, so to speak. Now, that alone could or could not mean what I think it means. But just now I was going through some gameplay footage I have from Persona 3 Reload, and I realized you know, the old documents that you collect in Tartarus that kind of give you a peek into the lore behind the Kirijo Group project from 10 years ago that kind of gets us where we are currently in the story. Old document 7, I believe it was, says, this is a paraphrase, and also the wording is different depending on which version of the game you're playing anyway, that it says something like, "I've realized their plan, it's super evil, but there's hope if people can learn to control the shadows within." Implication being that the persona power needed to fight these shadows comes from recognizing and taking control of the personal shadow within. I did check to make sure that this was there in earlier versions of the game and it wasn't like added in after Persona 4, and at least according to the Megami Tensei wiki, it looks like it has been there from the beginning in some form. It's been a very long time since I've played Persona 3 on the PS2, so I can't say for certain from my own memory, and I'm not I'm not going back to check. But these two things together have made me realize that this persona slash shadow entity dynamic thing is central to Persona lore in general. It is not unique to Persona 4. Obviously, this has some larger implications on what Persona is doing with Persona and Shadow and what those concepts mean within the Persona universe. I'm gonna have to roll that around in my brain a little bit more before I can speak on it at length, but I did feel like it was necessary to point out since I'm about to be yapping from a perspective that is misinformed. Also, while I'm editing this, I'm realizing one, my audio sucks, and two, I am just really bad at talking to a camera like a normal person. This is my first time doing something like this. I promise I will get better. Thank you.
And while persona and shadow are kind of mirror images of each other in the sense that persona is the desired public self and shadow is the rejected hidden self, I don't know that it makes sense to necessarily paint them as two alternating states when really they both exist simultaneously in all of us all of the time. In Persona 2.1, we see something similar, but it's a little less mallet to the head explicit. Each party member meets with the shadow version of themselves, which knows all of their secrets and provides the least charitable possible interpretation of their characters before being defeated in battle and dispelled by being told essentially, yeah, so what? I am you, and I'm a bunch of other stuff too. That really is how you have to deal with the shadow. So in Persona, we see these personal shadows that are linked to specific entities in the world of the games. But we also have these generic shadows that are essentially just the enemies we have to fight, but they don't represent any specific individual. These shadows don't seem to be symbolizing much other than just general threats to the psyche. Shadows can psychically kill a human in the world of Persona, resulting in Persona 5's mental shutdowns, Persona 3's apathy syndrome, or Persona 4's actual physical deaths. They don't have that much in common with the archetype of shadow, though, other than just being scary and coming from a symbolic realm of the unconscious. Now, Persona 5's reintegration of the negotiation mechanic that the original Personas inherited from Shin Megami Tensei allows Atlus to make a really interesting change to how these generic non-personal shadows work that gets a little bit closer to Jungian theory. Notably, in the original Personas, we're dealing with with demons, not shadows, as our enemies. And we can negotiate with these demons for items or tarot cards that will allow us to fuse personas in the Velvet Room with Igor. But demons and personas are different, separate entities, and one can't just become the other. In Personas 3 and 4, we swap demons for shadows as our enemy, but we lose the negotiation mechanic, and the shadows still remain their own separate library of guys from the personas. These shadows take on some dreamlike symbolic forms, but they aren't usually explicit references to specific mythic entities. Unless there's a myth about exploding Saturnine dice that I haven't heard yet. I'm sure these shadows are specifically designed to symbolize something. I just haven't quite figured it out yet, but maybe I will later. In Persona 5, though, we now have this same exact compendium of entities that can either function as shadows or as personas. This is a first for Persona, but it is how Shin Megami Tensei has worked in the past. If you recruit your demon enemy through negotiation, that now becomes your party member. We're doing something similar now with Persona 5. I'll let Morgana explain for us.
Whoa!
So, Morgana is describing archetypes here and suggesting that the archetypes hanging around in the collective unconscious, which again, we'll get to shortly, but in the context of Persona 5, collective unconscious is basically the metaverse as a whole, specifically and especially mementos. But basically, the archetypes hanging around in the collective unconscious are distorted by their proximity to these personal shadows, these mega shadows that are tied to specific entities in the real world. In Persona 5, if a person is really messed up, then their shadow becomes powerful enough to generate and live in its own palace within the metaverse. I guess inflicting its own personal unconscious onto the collective unconscious. Similarly to what we see with our party members' personal shadows in Persona 4, once a shadow in Persona 5 is reconnected to consciousness here via a successful negotiation, it can now be integrated into the personal conscious, in this case as a persona for Joker. And then, of course, we have the personal shadows, again in Persona 5, like we do in Personas 4 and 2. I don't think Persona 5 understands the personal shadow quite as well, though. You could make a case that the shadows of Futaba or Sainijima are caused by repression of the pieces of their personalities and personal histories that they don't want to confront, but our less sympathetic characters tend to just be blatantly evil in the conscious world with full awareness of their sins. Kamoshida flaunts his impunity to treat students however he pleases. Kaneshiro is a literal crime boss. He doesn't feel any shame for his actions. I think it's important to understand that the Jungian shadow is an entity that embodies what we are ashamed and afraid of, which often coincides with antisocial or unpopular traits and tendencies, but not always. Humans are a social species. Our brain structure has evolved to make us better, specifically at navigating large social groups and complicated social relationships. That's why our prefrontal cortices are so much larger than they are for most animals. Our pro-social evolutionary instincts make it pretty likely that when we behave selfishly, it will induce cognitive dissonance and we will feel weird about it. So a lot of the time, our shadow selves do contain our immoral or antisocial tendencies. However, there are a lot of people out there who are just selfish and don't really care. In that case, their drive to abuse and take advantage of others is not necessarily a shadow trait, it's just their personality. In fact, the empathy that they repress because they see it as weakness is their shadow trait. The shadow of someone like Kamoshida would not be an arrogant king, because that's basically who he is in real life. In fact, the shadow Kamoshida we meet in Persona 5 is functioning more like his persona. It is who he wants the world to see him as. I'd imagine that his actual shadow would be a weak and cowardly figure, since those are the traits that men like Kamoshida tend to be ashamed and afraid of. Again, I'm never going to be mad at Atlus for prioritizing the gameplay experience over absolute faithfulness to Jungian theories, but I do think it's important to point out that that's not really how a personal shadow would work. I love Shadow, for the record. It is my favorite Jungian archetype and just piece of Jungian theory in general. I do have a lot more to say, both in general and as a concept explored in Persona, but again, it's not really what we're here to do right now, so let's keep the train moving. Now, we have mentioned the unconscious quite a bit so far. Let's get into what that actually is. So, in Personas 1 and 2s, our parties are fighting demons within the same reality that everyone else experiences. Although they do visit Philemon in a different plane of consciousness, but most of the story takes place just in regular reality. Starting in Persona 3, our battles are being waged in a different dimension altogether, wherein the personas and shadows are contained. Tartarus, the TV world, and the metaverse are not consciously known to the public, although what happens within them does influence the outer reality. There is also this often referenced location called the Sea of Souls, from which personas seem to be summoned and released back into. I think that is also a nod to the collective unconscious. Now, Freud was the one to first popularize the idea of an unconscious dimension to the psyche, and you can think whatever you want about Freud, but that right there was pretty huge. Now, his idea of what the unconscious is and what goes on in there was weird, and we'll just leave it there. But Jung elaborated on this idea of the unconscious, And he split it into two different levels. There is the personal unconscious, which is every memory, emotion, or mental process that is tied to our personal experience, but not actively in our mind's eye at the moment. And then there was the collective unconscious, which is an inherited evolutionary psychic realm almost that all of humanity is instinctually influenced by and connected to. Now, a personal unconscious makes plenty of sense, right? I mean, last week I woke up with the song Sugar by Flo Rida stuck in my head, which is a song I have not heard or probably even thought about since the year of our Lord 2010. But it was in there somewhere all this time, lurking in my unconscious for 15 years before it decided to just randomly pop back into my conscious awareness one morning. They really don't make music like that anymore. I miss it. Now, a collective unconscious is a bit more of a struggle to grasp, and don't feel bad if you think it all sounds stupid. You are in great company. I can tell you from experience that being a person who takes Jungian theory seriously does not do you any favors in the world of academic psychology. Academic psychologists hate psychoanalytic theory, it seems like, and they are obsessed with asserting psychology as an empirical field of study. And like I said at the beginning of this, like, I do think that's the responsible way to approach psychology, even if I don't really believe it's going to be the full truth of how the psyche works. The collective unconscious is this dimension where the archetypes live and express themselves from. They belong to all of us and they exist a priori as instinctual blueprints in the psyche. Quote from Jung again, there are present in every individual, besides his personal memories, the great primordial images, those potentialities of human representations of things as they have always been, inherited through the brain structure from one generation to the next. End quote. Here, primordial images means archetypes. It's just an early term Jung used for the same concept. And this inherited brain structure that contains them is the collective unconscious. Now, it really is impossible to overstate what a profound effect Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection had on basically every branch of science, psychology obviously included here. Jung was developing his own theories about 50 or 60 years after Darwin's bomb of natural selection redefined so much. So it makes a lot of sense that evolution would be on Jung's mind as he attempts to articulate the concept of the collective unconscious. And indeed, Jung is using evolutionary language here to describe it. In his book, The Beginner's Guide to Jungian Psychology, Robin Roberts has this to say. We see that our brains contain evolutionary history within their very structure, and that ancient structure still controls much of the life we think that we live so consciously. If our evolutionary past is stored within us, there are only two ways they can appear in our lives. One, through behavioral actions in the outer world, that is what we normally term instinct, and two, through images in our inner world, which Jung initially termed primordial images and later archetypes, end quote. And so these evolutionarily inherited behavioral instincts are accompanied by evolutionarily inherited psychic models. The newborn baby cries and reaches out when she needs something that's instinct. She reaches toward mother specifically because of her inherited mother archetype. I'm going to read another passage from this book, Beginner's Guide to Jungian Psychology by Robin Roberts. This example of the child and her mother archetype is one I took from his work, and he's going to explain it a little more here. Imagine a human baby. It must contain a mother archetype that it imprints onto its own mother. That archetype seemingly contains the entire human history of the interaction of mother and child, and probably the entire animal history as well. A relationship that has been so important for so long gathers energy, energy which shapes the newborn baby's relationship with its physical mother. Each baby is unique and each mother is unique. Therefore, each baby has to graft its individual relationship with its mother onto the collective archetype of the mother. For example, at birth, a baby already knows how to suckle. As every bottle-fed baby knows, that behavior is certainly able to adapt to a bottle instead of a breast. Every baby knows how to cry and how to smile. If a baby cries and finds the mother instantly there to see what the problem is, it will grow up with a different adaptation to life than a baby whose mother ignores the crying and keeps to a set schedule of times for sleeping and feeding. Over the course of the years it takes to develop from infant to adult, each of us acquires a vast number of memories of his or her particular mother. These memories cluster around the archetype of the mother to form a complex of associations to mother. Essentially, we have formed a mother within who has both universal characteristics and characteristics specific to our particular mother. When we have to deal with situations similar to those we encountered with our mother, we draw on the mother complex within. For example, when a baby girl develops into a 3-year-old child and starts to do something she knows is bad, she might say out loud, "Bad girl." That is the internalized mother at work. If she falls down and scrapes her knee, she will run off to her mother for comfort. If the mother is not available, she will probably hug herself as if she were being hugged by her mother. When our baby girl finally grows to be an adult, she will keep drawing on the mother complex in appropriate situations. If her relationship with her mother has been healthy, she will be able to draw comfort and nourishment when needed from her inner mother. If her relationship with her mother has been unhealthy, she is likely to have difficulty trusting anyone because she will see any nurturing situation through the lens of her own sad experiences. Remember that the mother complex has at its core a collective archetype of mother that has nothing to do with the particular mother. In recent years, psychologists have begun to study children with terrible family backgrounds who somehow manage to become healthy and successful, frequently termed super kids. These children turn to other adults for the love and support they don't get from their parents. Sometimes they manage to find an adult or a special teacher who can become a substitute mother or father. More frequently, they manage to assemble the mother and father they need out of the characteristics of a number of adults. That's really quite amazing and only explainable if these children already have some inner template of the mother and father that they can match to their experiences in outer life. So I hope that helps it make a little bit more sense, the connection between the collective mother archetype and the personal mother archetype, and how the collective and personal unconsciouses sort of work together to create our own individual personalities. Basically, we see that every archetype is going to be experienced and developed differently depending on a person's temperament and life experience, but they're all inherited in the same way. That is the collective unconscious, the evolutionary inherited portion of our psyche that is the same for everyone, at least in its starting condition. The idea of a collective unconscious, while not considered very scientific, has maintained more traction, I think, in the literary/anthropology world than it has in psychology. The same kinds of stories play out over and over again in different mythologies and folklores, even from societies that never interacted with each other. So, back to Persona, the series, not the archetype. We see both collective and personal unconscious represented, at least in the later Persona games. Collective unconscious is name-checked as the place where Philemon hangs out in the early Personas, and there is some visual symbolism in this place that, again, I don't have time to get into right now, but it's related to the collective unconscious. And Philemon does seem to be acting as a sort of arbiter of the archetypes from this place. And it's implied that this collective unconscious is where human souls originate from. So we see it a little bit in this respect in the early personas, um, but that's about all I've been able to find so far. Now, in Persona 3, we have Tartarus. This is where the shadows live and originate from, and it's a separate but connected dimension to the rest of reality that's only accessible when everyone else is literally unconscious. This, I think, is a rudimentary depiction of the collective unconscious. And then in Persona 4, the most explicitly Jungian persona, we get the TV world, which is a dimension where anyone's shadow might be. The TV world as a whole has the potential to manifest anyone's psyche and connect them all together in the same space. What happens in the TV world indirectly affects what happens in real life Inaba, and the TV world projects some contextless images that kind of resemble weird dreams to the conscious citizens via the Midnight Channel. But Inaba's citizens are otherwise unaware of what is actually happening in the TV world. And just like in Persona 3, this brief window into the unconscious only appears at midnight when most people are sleeping. Each individual dungeon in the TV world is a sort of personal unconscious shaped by its denizens' memories, thoughts, and internal battles. And then Persona 5 gives us the personal unconscious in the form of its palaces. Again, each one connected to the psyche of a specific individual and ruled by that individual's shadow. The metaverse as a whole, and especially Mementos, is the collective unconscious. I mean, Morgana so much as calls it that directly. The heart of all humanity lives at Mementos' core, and the most messed up shadows may get their own palaces, but everyone else's shadow lives in Mementos. Now, we've got the question of the Velvet Room. Where is that? The Velvet Room is almost like a transporter between collective and personal, between conscious and unconscious. It's really the crossroads between all of it. Personas are extracted from the collective unconscious and delivered to the personal conscious via the Velvet Room. The Velvet Room is accessible through dreams. It's also accessible through the collective unconscious and through the conscious world. Elizabeth, Marie, Caroline, and Justine all belong to the unconscious, but still enter the conscious world and interact with it at times.
The moment man devoured the fruit of knowledge, he sealed his fate. Entrusting his future to the cards, he clings to a dim hope. Yes, the Arcana is the means by which all is revealed.
Very briefly, let's talk about the Arcana. I don't really have time to walk you through each card in the major arcana as much as I would love to. Like most millennial women, I did go through a tarot card, sage, and crystals phase for a couple of years there, and I've also literally always been a bit of a mystic as much as I try to be a scientist or an analyst. Jung found the sequence of the major arcana of the tarot to be powerful symbols of the human psyche's journey from birth until psychic maturation, assuming psychic maturation ever happens. In one of his essays, he says, "It seems as if the set of pictures in the tarot cards were distantly descended from the archetypes of transformation." Now, remember that Jung viewed spiritual and occult beliefs and symbols to be projections from the human psyche onto the world around us. The naive fool begins the quest of self-consciousness without any idea of what is to come, like a little child. The world, which is the final card in the tarot, or sorry, the final card in the major arcana of the tarot, the world is everything connected, complete, and understood, like a mature individual who has met and developed every part of themselves. In the book The Tarot by Alfred Douglas, there is a chapter on the significance of the tarot in Jungian theory. Here, Douglas says, to take up the challenge of directed individuation requires courage and determination. It is an heroic adventure, the age-old quest of the hero which appears in every culture under the guise of myth and legend. Temptations will constantly be encountered, agonizing choices frequently required, vigilance always called for. The perils and rewards of this quest are surely what the tarot is concerned with. Each of the 22 major trumps, sidebar, he uses the word trumps interchangeably with Arcana in this book. Each of the 22 major trumps describes a stage in the journey of life which is crucial in some way. Only by solving the riddle which each card in turn presents can the way ahead be opened up and the development of the personality taken further. I'll explain this directed individuation journey he speaks of in just a second here. Hey, no scratching the couch, Clem. I can and probably will at some point go through each individual major arcana card and explain its Jungian significance, because I think the Jungian connection is something a lot of people miss when they're talking about what the tarot and the major arcana mean for persona, but not today, because it's time for us to get into our finale.
I am a shadow, the true self. Myself. Me.
Here's a fun persona drinking game for ya. Take a shot every time you hear the phrase true self. What the hell is a true self? So, we just heard this word individuation when we were talking about the arcana. That is kind of the ultimate goal of incorporating Jungian theory. The end goal is to find and embody the capital S self. Again, the final card in the major arcana is the world, which symbolizes completion, wholeness, finishing of cycles. Who is the individual, though, when the individual is everyone and everything? Once we have confronted our shadows, incorporated our animas, and 100%ed the persona compendium, we are ready to transform into the self, or the great man, or the true self, or whatever you want to call it. The harmonious synthesis of conscious and unconscious. The clarity of purpose that this kind of inner wholeness provides, that is the self. And we should all be so lucky to find ourselves someday. This becoming of the capital S self is called individuation in Jungian vocabulary. Now, you've probably heard the term self-actualization before. We're talking about basically the same thing here. It's the pursuit of a complete and fulfilled self, comporting itself at the highest level of integrity. And it's not easy to get there. In fact, most people probably don't. But Jung believed that all of us can, so long as we have the strength to face ourselves and a sufficient amount of commitment to this alchemic inner journey. The self is kind of an archetype, but it's also kind of the gestalt amalgamation of all archetypes. And of course, we are always evolving, and so is our self. It's not like we cross a finish line of individuation and suddenly it's done and you are complete and perfect forever. The work is never truly over. In persona, we'll hear shadows claiming to be true selves and personas claiming to be true selves, and they're all right in a way because they're all parts of our true selves, and they all need to be incorporated for us to make our way to the self. Now, the work of the individuation process is not something teenagers are typically doing in real life. Jungian theory is actually thought to be more relevant to the latter half of life than the former half. I mean, how can you even start to incorporate the unconscious self when you haven't developed your conscious personality yet? You might have brushes with your shadow as a youngster, but the big shadow showdown is not going to come until you are an adult with an ego that's at least well enough developed to know what it doesn't want to be. I've wondered quite a bit about why and how a bunch of Japanese game devs ended up inspired by the work of a 20th century psychology oddball who is generally considered outdated. It's surprisingly hard to find the answer. In an interview I Google translated from Japanese, the creators of Persona say that they specifically wanted to explore adolescence and that moment on the threshold of adulthood, where a young person has to reckon with who they are apart from the structures of family and school and childhood friend groups. Something I've realized in my own experience on the client side of Jungian analysis is that when a child is assigned to or associated with certain archetypes, it can end up profoundly restricting them as adults. Breaking out of the role of problem child or perfect student or star athlete or whoever you've been told you are in your formative years is a massive and important undertaking. Again, I don't think very many people are doing that while they're still teenagers, but for the sake of the plot, I'll allow it in Persona. The important takeaway is, again, no one's true self is reducible to an archetype. This feels like a really important thing to get across to you because in the years that I've been researching archetype theory, I've been bombarded on the internet by targeted ads for apps or programs or websites that try to capture my attention by telling me, like, take this quiz to find out your archetype. And supposedly, if I find my archetype, that will help me dress myself perfectly, or meditate better, or attract men, or find the right therapy for me. That's not how any of this works. In fact, Jung himself very much cautioned against identifying too strongly with one specific archetype that's not considered healthy. So please hear me when I say this. You are not an archetype. You're also not a personality profile or a love language or a diagnosis or a Ravenclaw or a ballet corps dark academia coquette or whatever you guys are doing with aesthetics now. You are a human, and the entire array of human experience, feeling, behavior, and emotion is available to you and residing within you at all times. You are large, you contain multitudes. I have always felt that restricting humanity via identity is not a great idea. In fact, I am quite adamantly against strict categorization of the self because I think if you're doing the human experience right, you're gonna change your mind and your character quite a bit as you discover new things about the world and about yourself. You need to leave yourself that freedom to evolve. And you can't do that if you are constantly restricting and defining your identity with categorical judgments about who you are and aren't and should and can't be. Finding your way to wholeness, embracing the entirety of you and your psyche, that is individuation. When we drag the skeletons out of our closets, heal our psychic wounds, open ourselves up, and grow as large as we can be, then we become who we are meant to be, or who we are driven to be at our core if you don't believe in fate. This is the capital S self. I struggle sometimes because this work of directed individuation is kind of inherently self-centered, and it feels like maybe a poorer use of my time and energy than just focusing on helping others would be. But then if I'm the best version of myself, won't I be better at helping others? I don't really know. For better or worse, I have felt this call to individuate as long as I can remember, and I think some people just feel it and others just don't. I was doing this work before I really even knew what it was, and so it all feels pretty fated and necessary to me personally. Again, I don't think everyone feels this way, but maybe you do, and if you do, it does make a lot of sense that you would love Persona. Persona has so much to say about suffering and willpower and desire and time and death and growing up, but it is ultimately about becoming the true self, about what it takes to get there, the sacrifice and the drive that is required, and how much power that transformation holds when you do make it there. Without the context of Jungian theory, I don't think you can fully appreciate that in Persona. Now, in reality, individuation takes a really long time. Even just facing the shadow isn't a realistic expectation for someone who isn't at least in their late 20s. Atlus's world where teenagers save humanity by individuating is very cool, but it's not realistic and it's not what your or my individuation journey is going to look like. This work is lifelong. And of course, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. If your only interest in this stuff is how it influenced the development of your favorite video games, that is totally fine. And to any strict empiricists who managed to make it to the end of this video, I love you just for being here. But if you are curious about what lies below the conscious ego, if you do believe that there's a best version of yourself out there waiting to be found, Jungian theory might be very useful to you, and you can totally hit me up if it is, and I can help you get started. Now, we really just scratched the surface here today. Whether or not anyone watches this again, I will be back. I've got a lot more to say, and this project has been siphoning off a good 30% of my mental energy at all times for a year and a half now, so I'll keep going until I've said everything that I can. Again, if you want to be a part of that, go ahead and subscribe. 1 like equals 1 pet for Clementine. Yeah, leave me a comment if you've got a question or concern, or if you want to yell at me for getting something wrong, and I really hope someone sees this, but if not, hey, we're still doing the thing. Cool. Bye. Say bye, Clem.